Wait, Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you, Demir. Thank you, Danielle. Good morning to everybody, or afternoon if you're in different parts of the world. I'm Jeff Gedman with the American Interest. It is my pleasure to welcome you today. For those of you who may not know, the American Interest is print, online. We like to say we're helping Americans have a little bit of a window on the world and vice versa in times like these. Not nothing, as they say. And we're also devoted to defending and restoring the broad political center of American political thought and intellectual life. If you are not a subscriber, please feel warmly invited. Our associate publisher, Danielle Desjardins, will communicate with you in text via chat, both the YouTube audience and for the Zoom discussion participants this morning. But with that, I want to not stand in your way or between you and the main event. Let me introduce you to Charles Davidson, who is the co-founder of the American Interest, is the publisher. And Charles, you're now warmly invited to say what's on your mind and introduce our guest of honor.
Marvelous. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm first going to go over the logistics, and then I will introduce Bill Galston. So for those on Zoom, we'll use the raise hand function for questions. And then we hope to have many questions from our live YouTube audience, and those will be relayed to me via text message. So welcome, Bill. And I should make it clear that Bill is a member of the inner circle of the American Interest and has had and has a huge influence on what we do. And notably, he has inspired our current primary mission, which is rebuilding the political center in our country. We call this RPC because of course, we need an acronym. We're in the, after all, the fourth estate of government, and government loves acronyms. So we hope you're all on board with RPC. It's really wonderful to have Bill here. We've had him for, I think this is our third event, and we're doing many of these events during this coronavirus period. So we hope you'll keep an eye on what we're up to. There are many extraordinary things planned over the next 2-3 months, and this is all so successful. I imagine we'll continue doing it when things go back to normal. So Bill, it's great to see you, and let's roll. Oh, you wanted an opening question. So the main kickoff for this event is a piece that was published in the Wall Street Journal yesterday evening, that right-wing newspaper that we all love. And so we wanted to start off with Bill telling us about how much political reform he thinks we need in our country. Do we need to dig up the founding fathers, or do we just need a few little tweaks?
Neither of the above, actually. The piece in the Wall Street Journal laid out 3 large narratives that are now in play, ways of telling the American story. There's a narrative on the right to the effect that over the past 50 years, we have substantially closed the gap between our principles and our practices, so that the only problem that we have left in law enforcement is a few bad apples in police forces and maybe an abuse of mandatory minimum sentencing. The Civil Rights Acts of '64 and '65 stripped away legal barriers to full participation in the economy and society and the polity. And it's essentially the fault of people who are not taking advantage of those opportunities that we haven't achieved more equality in practice. There's another narrative on the left to the effect that our founding principles were corrupt from the beginning, that the real founding date of America isn't 1776, it's 1619. A very prominent national publication has urged this argument on us, and that and that the principles of 1776 are not adequate to the solution, and in some respects are part of the problem. The third narrative, and it's the one I defend in the piece, it's one that I associate not only with Abraham Lincoln, but also Frederick Douglass, and indeed a seamless history of American reform efforts from the very beginning, is that the principles of the Declaration as developed through our history represent a critical point of departure for judging current practices and pointing out areas where the gap between principles and practices is wide enough to require action. And that action can occur in a number of different political venues. It can also occur outside the political space through the operations of civil society, either directed toward the official political institutions of this country or addressed to society itself. And I could go through a long list of reforms that seem to me to be indicated by the gap between the principles of the Declaration as fleshed out in the Bill of Rights and the post-Civil War amendments and in other places, and our current practices. I think, for example, just pick out one or two, I think that the Supreme Court jumped the gun in saying that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was obsolete. Sandra Day, rather Ruth Bader Ginsburg's comment that it was tantamount to shutting your umbrella and throwing it away because it's no longer raining, rings true. I could talk about many reforms at the level of national institutions. And I can also talk about reforms of the criminal justice system, reforms of the economic system, et cetera, et cetera. In each of those cases, I argue, we already have the pole stars that we need. And the question is whether we're going to have the unity and the strength of purpose to navigate by those stars.
Wonderful, Bill. Now, let's see if we have, gosh, everyone is speechless, Bill. It's so hard to argue with you or come up with something you haven't covered in your thorough analyses. Now, we have a hand raised by
the first hand is always the hardest. After that, the dam breaks.
No, that's exactly right, and we'll run out of time, of course. And the first hand is raised by a very eloquent and brave person, Giselle Donnelly. Giselle?
There's that unmute button. I've got kind of, I also know that if I don't raise my hand first, the prospects of actually getting a word edgewise in such an erudite group will diminish substantially with time. But if I could offer a fourth possible narrative, which is to sort of promote my own work a little bit, but if you can excuse that. And that is, it's not 1776. It's not 1619, but it's sometime about 1580, where we should mark the beginning of the American experiment from. The date being the time when English-speaking peoples and Englishmen got serious about trying to colonize North America as a way to compete internationally with the Spanish Empire and to protect the geopolitical liberties of Europe against counter-reformation. In other words, there's a pre-existing narrative of liberty and freedom that was certainly marred by the importation of slaves and the development of a slave society in the American South. But I think it's worth taking in the full narrative of American history as a way of properly framing what has been a constant reform effort ever since then. Kind of a way of trumping the 1619 narrative, both in a sort of narrow chronological sense, but in a broader ideological and intellectual sense. I think to sort of just fall back on 1776 has some political shortcomings that we see playing out even now. But to contest the idea that the enterprise was rotten from the start, and certainly the writings of the first colonists and the remarkable continuity between the way they thought about politics, about morality, and the ideals which propelled them, I think make a useful counterbalance to the 1619 narrative and enrich our understanding of the previous 1776 narrative. So I'll stop there, but I'd be interested in Bill's reaction and indeed everybody's reaction to this crazy idea.
Well, look, this would be a very long and heavily footnoted discussion, as I'm sure you know, and time doesn't permit its full exploration. You know, suffice it to say that Thomas Jefferson, you know, later in life, wrote a letter to a friend in which he described what he was trying to do with his draft of the Declaration. And he described it as a sort of a synthesis of what he called the American mind, right? And in writing it, he tried to draw on multiple traditions. I mean, he didn't completely spell them out, but he talked about the classical Roman tradition. He mentioned Scottish moral philosophy, of course, the Lockean tradition, and the religious tradition. And so I see 1776 as really, a lake into which those streams flowed. And, as an expression of the American mind in full, as Jefferson understood it, and not just a piece of it. Having said that, I also believe that in the American tent, John Locke and his reception in the colonies and in the early republic was the long pole. I could give a lot of evidence in favor of that, including Jefferson's marginal comments on Locke's second treatise of government, which are quite interesting in their own right. But you've raised a very large historical question. Just one more piece of the answer, and that is, as you know, in the 19th century, the question as to whether the Declaration was encoding the rights, duties, and privileges of Englishmen, or whether it stood for something more abstract than that, came to the center of political debate. And the locus classicus is the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where Douglas takes the rights and duties of Englishmen position as a way of narrowing the scope of the principles of the Declaration and removing its critical force, for the treatment of African Americans in the United States. Lincoln took the other side, and it's not just the case that victors get to write the history. It was also, I would argue, the decisively right side, and Lincoln's interpretation of the Declaration stands as an immortal and unbreachable barrier against ethno-nationalisms of every description, or it should.
Wonderful. Well, I should say for our audience, just so they know, Giselle Donnelly is at the American Enterprise Institute, and she is a contributing editor to the American Interest magazine. And next up, we have a medical doctor who also has a PhD in political science, who is also a contributing editor to the American Interest, Ronald Dworkin.
Yes, my bandwidth does not allow me to have both the video and the audio. I'm sorry. Bill, I had a question for you. You offer three narratives as a possibility. I like the third, which is reforming the institutions we have in place. And you mentioned economic, social, national institutions. One institution I'm particularly interested in is the university, where you teach. So you know the university as well. And they are a source of a lot of the unrest and the very radical ideas in the second narrative that you brought up. And I was wondering what your thoughts about how to reform them. Now, I know people at other public policy centers have been working for the last decade to improve free speech and limit censorship. But I wonder to what degree it's too late for that. And I wonder what you would do. For example, here is my idea. The technical and scientific colleges, they offer value. They should stay and be encouraged. The state universities had the protection of the First Amendment because they're government. And they have a wide variety of programs that are pre-professional and therefore of value. But the small liberal arts colleges don't offer any particular value. They're a source of a lot of the unrest and radical ideas. They're very, very expensive. And many people don't really want to go to college in the first place, so there's a bottleneck there. What would your thoughts be about just simply, since they're financially strapped now, just letting them go, just letting them go? Would that be, let them go under, in other words? Would that be a good thing to your mind, or would you have any other reform in mind?
Well, a complex set of reactions. First of all, most of those small liberal arts colleges that you're referring to and are part of a very wide spectrum of American educational institutions. And I suspect I could name ones that you would love and ones that you would detest, and everything in between. To a first approximation, most of them are private. And so I'm not in favor of a national policy that makes it either easier for them or harder for them. I think they should remain or wither away on their own merits. And indeed, there's an argument right now that the current, the health created financial crisis will have a winnowing effect. I take no position on whether that effect will be for good or ill, but if you just look at the demographics, there will be fewer young people entering college in all probability because of lower birth cohorts, lower birth rates, and there will be a time of reckoning and consolidation in American higher education, which, by the way, I'm no longer a member of. I teach occasional guest classes, but I haven't really been on the teaching faculty of any university since I left the University of Maryland for Brookings almost 13 years ago. I should also say that I think it's possible to exaggerate, and many people do exaggerate, the impact of higher education on American politics. Yes, you can see certain terminology from college classrooms making their way into public debate. You can also see a diversity of responses within the university community, some of which are quite helpful. For example, my alma mater, the University of Chicago, issued a policy statement on behalf of the university and binding on all parts of the university about 5 years ago that reiterated in the strongest possible terms classic university norms of freedom of inquiry, freedom of teaching, subject only to the broad professional responsibilities that every teacher and every member of the academic community has. So don't underestimate the amount of useful debate that's going on in the university sector. But I recur to first principles. The worst thing we need is publicly enforced substantive standards for teaching at colleges and universities. I can't imagine that anybody would want to see that.
All right, Bill, the questions are now piling up as though we suddenly are offering free COVID testing or something. So first of all, from Rob Benjamin asks, what about a fifth narrative? Colin Woodard's description of America as a collection of different incompatible nations, not all committed to the ideals of the Declaration and some hostile to them.
Well, I'm not sure of the empirical basis for that claim, or to put it more modestly, I'm not sure about the empirical significance of that claim. I'm sure you could find members of subcommunities, perhaps measurable minorities of subcommunities of all kinds, spread across the political and social spectrum, who, when actually faced with a classic articulation of American principles, would say, no, I don't believe that. As a matter of fact, there were some political science experiments back in the 1950s at the time of the peak influence of Joe McCarthy that suggested a less than vigorous attachment to principles of free speech, freedom of association, et cetera, for political groups that were seen as threats, the Communist Party first and foremost among them. But someone from whom I learned a great deal, the late Robert Goldwyn, who was attached to the American Enterprise Institute, once said that the Americans believe in liberty in their bones, right? Even if they can't articulate the principles, and even if they say things opposed to the principles, when the chips are down, we will end up defending the core of the nation. And I could give an enormous number of examples. One of my favorites, one I studied, is the very interesting 3 years between 1941 and 1944, during which the Supreme Court changed its mind on the question of whether it was constitutional and consistent with traditions of American liberty to require force on pain of expulsion school children to stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. The objectors were Jehovah's Witnesses. This was during the Second World War, where patriotic fervor was at its peak. And the Supreme Court said, this was very unusual. Just 3 years ago in 1941, we made a big mistake when we said that the Constitution and our principles of liberty would permit any public institution to coerce children to do anything of the sort. And I could give example after example of times in which, when the chips were down, and Americans were confronted in an unmistakable way with evidence of what I'll call constitutional injustice, that they turned in the direction of constitutional justice. And I will say controversially that I think we are experiencing one of those times as we speak. So no, I respect Colin Woodward as an author, but I'm not inclined to accept his thesis as you articulated it.
Good. Susie Garment had her hand raised. Susie, are you still there? Otherwise we'll go to the next person.
No, she's still there. She's just muted. There she is.
Hi, Bill.
Susie, it's been too long.
Yeah, actually, after this, we will make it not so long. However,
Yes.
a current events question on this theme that you've just been speaking about. The letter this morning in the New York Times, the scholars saying there's much too much. Is that something that you could sign on to?
I haven't read the letter. I wasn't asked to sign, but I read that article in the Times with great interest. 153 prominent scholars signed it. It was a letter, I think, spearheaded by the African-American scholar Thomas Chatterton Williams, a very interesting man in his own right. And the range of signatories, both ideologically and ethnically and in every other way, was truly impressive. When I read the letter, I suspect I will find much more in it to agree with than to disagree with. I was just having a conversation with my friend and Brookings colleague, Jonathan Rausch, about this over the past 24 hours. I see Jonathan is with us. He may want to get into the conversation at some point. And I see it potentially as a very important contribution and perhaps even a turning point. As someone who spent 3 decades in academia, I am appalled by enforced orthodoxy wherever it comes from. I'm a child of people whose, of parents whose friends suffered greatly during the McCarthy period. I didn't like it then, and I don't like it anymore now. And I think that the principles that I began by articulating, give us ample grounds to reject enforced orthodoxy. And for the best articulation of the case against enforced orthodoxy, read Justice Robert Jackson's concurring opinion in West Virginia v. Barnett, the 1944 case that I referred to a couple of minutes ago that overturned the mandatory flag salute.
Wonderful. Greg Pfeiffer, please. Greg, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Charles. And forgive me, I joined a little bit late, so missed the very beginning. And apologies also for bringing the conversation back to our president. But we have never had a bad faith actor as a president to this degree before, in my mind, so that despite our founding principles and the intellectual history on which they're based, our institutions don't seem to even currently have the language to be able to combat it. So, for example, I've seen a lot of talk about Trump's talk about reopening the economy, reopening our schools to be reckless, but this is beyond reckless in my mind. This is a full-on attempt to disrupt society and spread fear, and which seems to be his election campaign strategy. So that you've written recently very, very eloquently, convincingly about his numbers, his polling numbers, and how the Trump campaign is in a very difficult position. But it seems to me the campaign's not worried about that at all, and we are not even we're not worried enough about what the campaign is interested in, probably, and that is voter suppression. So that how can we well, what can we do more to talk about or come to an understanding about what actually is going on from our founding principles, when it seems that in the public discourse we're not even quite describing what is actually going on? Thank you.
Well, I'm with George Orwell on this one. You know, that in times like this, the first duty of people like us is to restate the obvious. I just, state the plain common sense of the matter. So that's point number one. Relentlessly true description. Not ideological screeds, but cool, evidence-based descriptions of what is actually going on. That's recommendation number one. Number two, there are a lot of people thinking through the particular dangers of the present moment. I'm a member of a number of different groups trying to anticipate the risks to the integrity of the 2020 election, and to use military language, to pre-position the troops and supplies that will be needed in order to reduce those risks as far as possible. But your question, I think, invites a broader reflection. I've spent a lot of time studying the founding period, the Constitution. I read the Federalist Papers more faithfully, I'm afraid, than I read the Bible, though I try to keep up on a weekly basis. There is language at the beginning and the end of the Federalist Papers that is perfectly adequate to the description of our current moment. And we have to blow the dust off it and use it. Take a look at what Alexander Hamilton had to say about demagoguery, I believe, in the very first Federalist paper. How populism and the thrust towards tyranny are intimately linked. Or recall what James Madison said about the definition of tyranny, which is the accumulation of all powers of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, in a single set of hands. So I think before we say that we don't have our tradition doesn't give us the vocabulary to talk about this, let's try to, as individuals, as scholars, as thinkers, as citizens, try to reacquaint ourselves with the moral vocabulary that our tradition actually contains, and much of which has been forgotten because it's so poorly taught in the educational institutions where it ought to be much more central. But the fact of the matter is, whatever you want to call our democracy, our constitutional republic, ultimately it gets back to the judgment of the people as to what's good or bad, what's tolerable or intolerable. The ultimate faith of democracy is that when people make a mistake, they will be able to correct it. It is not that people never make a mistake. It's that their common sense, their will to do the right thing, even if they aren't sure what the right thing is, will ultimately trump competing impulses. I think the democratic faith is that self-corrective impulse will prove stronger than all of its competitors. If that's not true, then ultimately we'll end up on the rocks, whatever institutional policy reforms we institute. And I continue to believe, not know, but believe that it is true. It's not an invitation to complacency, but it is an invitation to hope.
Bill, next we have a question from Eric Hunts. There are two question marks. There's two sentences to it. The first one sounds like a plant from Francis Fukuyama, and the second one will follow. So the first sentence is, would you argue that the current situation is the result of institutional decay over 50 years? And the second part of this is, how will current levels of inequality impact rebuilding such institutions?
Well, the answer to the first question is complicated. And my take on it is accepted by some, but not all by any means. And that is that we've just back up. The founders, the people who wrote the Constitution, did not expect the formation of political parties. They did not want the formation of political parties. Part of the Madisonian design, which he was very frank about in Federalist 10, was to prevent the formation of broad opposed phalanxes in favor of a shifting kaleidoscope of smaller groups constituted by differences of interest, of affection, and belief. Nevertheless, within just a few years after the Constitution went into operation, we had political parties. In fact, we had the minimum number that a democracy requires, namely 2. And with a few brief diversions into single party democracy, as in the era of good feeling, and fragmented democracy, as in the 1860 election, we've had 2 political parties throughout our history. From which it follows that our institutions are not going to be well ordered if the 2 political parties have a relationship that makes functioning government all but impossible. And what are the circumstances within which that bad reality manifests itself? Well, consider a classic 2x2 table. And along one dimension, you have parties that are either deeply divided, by policy and even by ideological conviction, and those that aren't. And along the other axis, you have parties that are substantially divided in their and differ in their strength, or parties that are relatively narrowly and evenly balanced. And what I want to suggest is that the very worst quadrant for our constitutional order as it has developed is a situation in which the parties are both deeply divided and narrowly divided. And that is the situation which we've been in increasingly in recent decades. Under those circumstances, when the parties are at loggerheads and there is no dominant political party, our institutions, and particularly our legislative institutions, grind to a halt for the most part, or they slow very significantly, creating distortions and a vacuum where the legislative art should be practiced that ends up strengthening, and I would say, distorting both the executive branch and the judiciary. And that is the process, I believe, that's been playing out in recent decades. Now, does that mean that our constitutional institutions are decaying? Or does it mean that a non-constitutional institution, but not an unconstitutional institution, namely the party system, is decaying? And I say the right answer is much more the latter than the former. If we had a functional party system, we'd have functional constitutional institutions. As we don't, we don't. Which is why I've spent so much of my time as a practitioner trying to find ways for the two political parties to become more, I won't say center seeking, but compromise seeking, developing, trying to strengthen the forces within both political parties that seek to build on the common ground that does exist. Just one further point, survey research, much of which I consume, a bit of which I produce, tells me that in the American electorate as a whole, the area of common ground is much greater than a casual inspection of the rhetoric of the leaders of our two political parties would suggest. And so part of what our times require is an appeal from the parties as they express themselves to the people themselves. And the first party that manages to nominate a candidate who gets that appeal right, I believe, will carry the future.
Marvelous, Bill.
Wait a minute. There's a second question. There's a second half of the question that I forgot to answer.
Oh,
and that is, the challenges posed, the challenges posed by inequality. Here, I'm with Aristotle, who said in the Politics what many modern sociologists like Seymour Martin Lipset and others have affirmed more recently, namely that in the absence of a strong and self-confident middle class, if you have a situation where the middle class feels beleaguered and you are seeing simultaneously a concentration of wealth in fewer hands and more economic insecurity for more and more people, that is not the precondition for a healthy liberal democracy. And so I favor economic reforms that strengthen the middle class, improve the opportunities for people who are struggling to get into the middle class to actually attain that status, and where necessary, pruning back oligarchic privileges that have been allowed to arise in our society. And I do not think it's written in stone, for example, that the sons and daughters of wealthy people should be able to inherit as much as they do now under the tax regime that we do now. You could get me to sound pretty radical on this theme if you pushed me a little.
Well, thank you, Bill. We now have a question from one of the American Interests editors, Aaron Sabarian.
Thank you, Charles. Bill, I wanted to go back to you talking about the New York Times and specifically the question of institutional legitimacy. The second narrative you mentioned has now been pushed quite strongly by the nation's official paper of record and unofficially by many other similar institutions. And it seems to me that there's kind of two possible pathways this could take. One is that these institutions retain their legitimacy and thus succeed in pushing huge swaths of the country towards this narrative, one that you've said is unhealthy. Or B, and I think in some ways this is the more optimistic narrative, these institutions, push the country towards the kind of 1619 stuff. They go towards that themselves, but most of the country just kind of stops listening to them because they're like, well, no, that's absurd. And in that case, you'd have the New York Times lose a lot of its legitimacy and a lot of its opinion shaping power. And you wouldn't maybe end up with the 1619 narrative being accepted by half the country. On the other hand, you would kind of continue the epistemic polarization of America and have fewer and fewer sources of legitimacy, which would seem to undermine the project of creating a liberal center. So what do you think is the more likely scenario, and how do you navigate the challenges associated with both?
Well, good question, Aaron. I mean, the New York Times will pursue the path that its editor-in-chief and publisher have marked out for it. And I think they've made a choice to be a mission-driven publication. By that, I mean politically mission-driven. I can still recognize good reporting when I see it. I read the Times from cover to cover every day. There are some parts of it that I take more seriously than others. When I see good foreign policy reporting in the Times, which I do every day, I put that in the bank. And there are other areas of the paper where the line between news and news analysis seems to me to have broken down completely. The New York Times is not the only guilty party in that connection, but it is highly visible. To answer your question directly, I think that over time, the Times will preserve its standing as the spokesman for a piece of the American population that is already disposed to believe what the Times is saying. I don't think that's where the center of gravity of the country is. And I don't think that's a position to which the country as a whole is likely to move. I think people in general, and this is part of my democratic faith with a small d, are capable of determining for themselves which part of the message of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or any other newspaper they think makes sense and are willing to accept. So I'm a defender of press freedom. That's easy to say. I think everybody is, and so far be it from me to try to use any instruments of power to tell the New York Times how to conduct its own business. They presumably have evaluated the risks and benefits of the course they're now on and have decided, for whatever reason, that the Times with a small t demand continuing down the path that they've chosen. I'm not thrilled with that path, but it just means that in my own small way, I'll employ more skeptical reading techniques to some parts of the Times than I used to. So be it.
Bill, we have a question from Lawrence Haas.
Hi, Larry.
Hello, Bill. How are you?
Like everybody else, I'm afraid.
I have a question that relates a bit to what you were just discussing with the New York Times and the center of gravity, but really goes back to what you were talking about before with regard to the parties. Parties, I tend to be skeptical in terms of thinking about any moment as this monumental moment of change, including the current moment. I think it's always good to sort of set yourself in history and realize how long history lasts and the continuums of history. Having said that, you've spent a lot of time, as I have and others have, thinking about the broad center of America And I don't know if in my lifetime I can think of a time when the broad center of America was so unrepresented, in a sense, by the two political parties, particularly now. If you think about issues, you think about sort of, to the extent that there's consensus in America, I don't think it would be too hard to find 60 or 70% of Americans agreeing on some pretty basic things. Fiscal responsibility, a certain libertarianism with regard to social issues, strong defense, I think, for the most part. I'm wondering, despite what I said about downplaying whether this is a moment in history, I do wonder about the future of the two political parties. You know, the Federalist Party withered away before too long because it was sort of seen as not representing the country and sort of moving off to a fringe. The Republican Party arose rather quickly and occupied the White House, sort of almost out of nowhere in a historical sense. And the two parties that we now have been around a long time, particularly with regard to the Trumpian takeover of the Republican Party and the leftist takeover of the Democratic Party, as represented by all sorts of things, not unrelated to the 1619 Project, I might point out. I'm just kind of wondering whether you see the reforms coming from within the party, or whether this really is a moment when someone could lead, even in the face of all the institutional obstacles, someone could lead the development of a centrist party to either compete or replace one of the two parties. And I would think the one it would replace most likely would be the Republican Party, but I'm not quite sure about that. So I know that's a very broad question, but I'm just kind of wondering about your thoughts about America's center and the future of our two political parties, particularly with regard to the directions that they seem to be heading in.
Well, putting on my political scientist hat for just a minute, the basic rules of the electoral game in the United States push very strongly in favor of a two-party system as opposed to a multi-party system. I don't expect that to change. And so the only way for a new party to form and become viable is to replace and or kill off one of the existing parties. I think it's more likely that the two political parties will be zones of contestation internally as well as externally. For better or for worse, the future directions of American politics will be worked out in intra-party debates. And I mean, there's one scenario, and I'm not predicting it, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out, where Biden's victory, if he does win, would be more sweeping than even the Democratic Party's optimists are daring to hope right now, that it would not only increase the majority in the House, but sweep away a lot of Republican senators who don't think of themselves as being particularly vulnerable. Under those circumstances, unless political history has been repealed, a great debate will break out within the Republican Party about its future. I note with interest that there were articles in two national newspapers this morning on the intentions of the Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, to run for president. Based on what I know about him, I am quite confident that he intends to do so. And he will do so, representing the view of the Republican Party that John Kasich upheld in 2016 and was one of the finalists, but didn't come close to winning. So the question is, will the kinds of instincts that Kasich and other moderate conservatives represented within the Republican Party, with instincts that have been marginalized in recent years, will they come back to the fore? And who is going to get to where the people are first? That's the essential question. And I agree with you right now that there are forces in both political parties pulling against that. Although I would note that Democrats had ample opportunity both in 2016 and in 2020, to endorse the modern equivalent of Henry Wallace, and they refused to do so. Right. So I reject the proposition that there has been, quote unquote, a left-wing takeover of the Democratic Party. The progressive wing of the party is much stronger than it has been for many decades. And as a result, there's more competition and more dialogue. Elliot Engel is the latest mainstream Democrat to fall, but he won't be the last. So yeah, there are tendencies within the party pulling away from where I think most Americans are, but there are also tendencies within the party pulling strongly in the other direction. And so far, I would say those have been the dominant tendencies. The loudest voices in a political party are not always the most representative voices, and I don't think they are in this case. To be continued.
Yes, indeed. And I'm afraid we're going to have to bring this to a close because the church bell is about to ring. So thank you, Bill, from the bottom of my heart for bringing us RPC and for your participation in our enterprise. It's been a great honor and incredibly useful. We owe a lot to you. I would just like to mention before everybody signs off that we do have an event coming up August 4th that is decidedly glamorous, where Bernard-Henri Lévy will be in conversation with Francis Fukuyama. This will be August 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We hope many of you will join us then, and we hope all of you will be subscribers within 10-15 minutes of now, if you aren't already. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Jeff. Bye.
Hi, Bill. Thanks.